The letter from Bernard Halley arrived on a Tuesday, which was the day Ruth Calloway had set aside for calling creditors. She had a system. 3 per Tuesday, rotating through the stack of past due notices lined along the kitchen counter like a row of small accusations, so no single account felt neglected enough to send a collections agent to her door. It was the kind of organizational discipline born from 12 years of running a dental practice's front desk, redirected now, in the 18 months since Dale had died, toward the patient management of catastrophe. She was sitting with the phone in one hand and a pen in the other, the medical bills spread across the kitchen table in the particular order she'd learned helped her feel less like she was drowning when she heard the mail slot clatter. She didn't look up immediately. Lately, so nothing arriving through that slot was worth interrupting her arithmetic for. But the envelope from Montana was different. Cream-colored, heavy stock, the kind of envelope that came from an office that took itself seriously. She read it standing at the door in her housecoat, cold November air pushing through the gap in the weather, stripping she'd been meaning to fix since September. Her hands were dry from the dish soap she used because the moisturizing kind cost 40 cents more per bottle, and 40 cents was a number she now thought about. Bernard Halley, attorney at law, Ridge Creek, Montana. Dear Mrs. Calloway, it is with sincere condolences that I write to inform you of the passing of your great-uncle, Earl Theodore Whitmore, on October the 18th of this year, at the age of 94. Per the terms of his last will and testament, I executed in this office in the year 2019, you are named sole beneficiary of his estate, which consists of the following: 200 acres of agricultural land, Ridge Creek Township, eastern Montana, 1 farmhouse, circa 1934, with attached utility structures, 1 hay barn, approximately 4,000 square feet, constructed 1938. Current county assessed value, $38,000. I would ask that you contact my office at your earliest convenience to discuss the transfer of deed and to collect certain personal effects Mr. Whitmore wished delivered to you directly. He was very specific on this last point. Ruth read it 3 times. Then she sat down on the cold tile floor of her entryway, which she hadn't meant to do, but her legs had quietly made that decision for her, and it seemed rude to argue with them. Earl, her mother's uncle, and she'd met him exactly twice in her 56 years on Earth. The first time at a family reunion when she was 11, a 4th of July gathering at her grandmother's farm in Oklahoma, where Earl had stood apart from everyone else near the fence line, holding a cup of coffee he never drank from, watching the cousins and the aunts and the uncles with the quiet patience of someone who didn't quite believe in the existence of other people. He'd answered questions in single sentences and asked none. He'd eaten alone. When Ruth's mother had called him peculiar on the drive home, her father had said, "Earl's just particular about who he spends himself on," and left it at that. The second time was at Ruth's mother's funeral, 22 years ago. Earl had driven 4 hours in a truck so old the cab shook at every red light. He'd stood in the back of the room during the service. Afterward, he'd pressed a folded $20 bill into Ruth's hand, a bill so worn it had gone soft as cloth, and said only, "She was the best of all of us, your mother." Then he'd driven back to Montana without eating the reception food or speaking to another soul. She hadn't heard a word from him since, and now he'd left her 200 acres of dry Montana scrubland and a rotting barn, assessed at $38,000, which after estate fees and transfer costs would probably net her something close to nothing. She folded the letter and sat with it in her lap and thought about the $180,000 in medical debt Dale's cancer treatment had left behind. She thought about the $1,200 per month mortgage payment she was 5 months behind on. And she thought about the $112 in her checking account and the fact that she'd been eating oatmeal for breakfast and lunch 3 days a week since August because oatmeal was $2.89 for a 2-pound container, and it stretched. She thought about the job she'd lost in March when the dental practice where she'd worked since her 30s had quietly folded after the dentist retired, and the landlord tripled the rent, and there was nobody left to answer the phones for. Then she called her son. Marcus answered on the second ring, which meant he was between meetings or in the car. His voice carried the particular clipped energy of a man who'd organized his life around efficiency and had very little patience for events that didn't fit the schedule. "Hey, Mom, everything okay?" "I got a letter," Ruth said, "from a lawyer in Montana, about your great-great-uncle Earl. He passed away last month." A pause. "Earl Whitmore, the guy you met like twice. He left me his estate." Another pause, this one longer. She could hear Marcus processing the word estate and recalibrating downward when he remembered who they were talking about. "What kind of estate?" 200 acres, a farmhouse, a hay barn." The silence that followed was not the silence of a man impressed. It was the silence of a man doing arithmetic and not liking the answer. "Mom, 200 acres of what, exactly?" "Where?" "Eastern Montana, near a town called Ridge Creek." She heard him exhale. "Eastern Montana. So essentially a desert." "Mom, I looked up property values out there a few years ago when Lindsay and I were talking about. It doesn't matter. The point is, land like that, 200 acres of dry grazing land with no water rights and no improvements. You're looking at maybe $150, $200 an acre. That's $40,000 at the absolute ceiling. And that's before estate fees eat half of it. The letter says $38,000 assessed value. Right. So maybe 20 after fees. Mom." His voice shifted into something gentler, but still fundamentally practical. "That's not nothing, but it's not something either. Have the attorney list it with a local realtor, sign whatever you need to sign, and be done with it. You don't need to go out there. It's a barn." He said Earl left me some personal effects, that he was very specific about me receiving them in person. "So ask them to mail whatever it is. An old watch, a pocket knife. And that's what these things usually are." She could hear Lindsay's voice somewhere in the background now, asking a question Marcus covered the phone to answer. When he came back, his voice had taken on the decisive quality it got when Lindsay had weighed in. "Mom, seriously. Don't spend money you don't have driving to Montana to pick up a barn full of nothing. Just have them list it. $20,000 would at least help with the, you know." He didn't say the debt. He never said the specific words. She thought it was because naming it felt, to Marcus, like admitting that his father's death had left his mother in a situation he couldn't fix, and Marcus didn't like unfixable situations. "I'll think about it," Ruth said. "Mom." "I'll think about it, Marcus." After she hung up, she sat for a while longer at the kitchen table. The medical bills were still spread across it in their careful order. Outside, a November wind was pushing brown leaves against the fence, and the house made the particular creaking sound it had been making for 3 months, that she suspected meant something structural and had been pretending not to hear. She opened the letter again and reread the last line. He was very specific on this last point. Earl Whitmore had been specific about almost nothing in his life, as far as she knew. He'd lived alone for 9 decades, spoken in single sentences, attended one family funeral in 20 years, and pressed a soft $20 bill into the hand of a woman he barely knew, and called her mother the best of all of them. The kind of man who said almost nothing didn't get specific without a reason. She folded the letter, put it in the front pocket of her purse, and the next morning, before she talked herself out of it, she called Bernard Halley's office and said she'd be there by Friday. She told herself it was about the personal effects. That was easier to defend to Marcus, who called twice more before Thursday, to lay out the math again in different configurations, each one arriving at the same conclusion. The barn was worth nothing, and the trip would cost her gas money she didn't have, and 2 days she couldn't spare from the job applications she was supposed to be submitting. His wife Lindsay sent a text that read, "Ruth, honey, we just want what's best for you. This doesn't seem like the best use of your time or resources right now. Love you." Ruth read it and put her phone face down on the passenger seat and drove north. The drive from Wichita to Ridge Creek was 14 hours. She split it over 2 days, sleeping at a Motel 6 in Billings, where the room smelled of industrial cleaner and the heating unit rattled like something was trapped inside it. She ate a gas station sandwich for dinner and drank vending machine coffee in the morning and told herself this was fine. She'd done harder things, which was true, though she was struggling at the moment to specify what they were. On the second day, the highway narrowed and the towns grew sparse, and the landscape opened into something that wasn't quite beautiful, but was so enormous and so indifferent that she found it almost restful. Montana in November was the color of an old photograph. Pale gold grass, gray sky, the occasional dark line of a creek, bottom marked by cottonwoods that had given up their leaves. She passed through 3 towns she nearly missed blinking, each one a grain elevator and a gas station, and a few dozen houses arranged around a block that might have been ambitious 60 years ago. Ridge Creek had a single main street and a population sign that read 412 and looked like it had been optimistic when installed. A hardware store. A diner called the Rimrock Cafe, whose neon sign worked on one end. A feed supply with a parking lot full of pickups. A church with a marquee offering wisdom she didn't stop to read. Bernard Halley's office sat above the hardware store, a flight of exterior stairs leading to a door, with his name stenciled on the frosted glass in gold letters that were starting to flake. She climbed the stairs with her purse over one shoulder, and her determination held in place by the particular stubbornness of a woman who had driven 14 hours and was not going to let herself feel foolish about it yet. Bernard Halley was a man in his mid-60s who looked like he'd grown up here and never seriously considered leaving, which Ruth found immediately reassuring. He had a broad, plain face and reading glasses on a cord around his neck, and the unhurried manner of someone who understood that most things in life eventually resolved themselves if you didn't panic them to death. He shook her hand and poured her coffee without asking, and sat across his desk from her in a way that suggested he had all afternoon and no particular place to be. "I appreciate you making the drive," he said, "and Earl was hoping you would." He said that. He said, Bernard paused, choosing his words. He said most people wouldn't, but that you might. He slid a folder across the desk. Deed transfer is straightforward. Earl owned the property free and clear, no liens, taxes paid through the end of the year. You'll just need to sign here and here and here, and the property is yours as of today. Ruth signed where he pointed. Her handwriting looked strange to her, like it belonged to someone who had plans. "The personal effects he mentioned," she said. "Can I ask what they are?" Bernard reached into his desk drawer and produced a manila envelope, letter-sized, sealed with brown tape that had been applied carefully and reinforced at the corners. Her name was written across the front in handwriting she didn't recognize. Angular, deliberate, to the penmanship of a man who'd learned to write when writing was treated as a skill worth teaching. He set it on the desk between them. "Earl's instructions were that you receive this in person after signing the deed, and that you not open it until you have been inside the hay barn." He was very clear on the sequence. Bernard's expression was neutral, in the careful way of a man who'd decided some time ago that his job was to execute instructions, not to evaluate them. "He also said to tell you." He glanced at a notepad. "He wrote it out for me, because he didn't trust himself to say it right. He said to tell you. Don't let anyone else tell you what you're looking at. Look for yourself first." Ruth stared at the envelope. "He didn't give you any indication of what's in it?" "No, ma'am. Earl didn't volunteer information. That was something of a defining characteristic." The faintest smile crossed Bernard's face, fond and a little tired. "I handled his affairs for 14 years. I know he filed his taxes on time and maintained the property carefully and paid every bill the day it arrived. I know he read extensively. He donated several boxes of books to the library each year, philosophy mostly, some history. I know he went to church Christmas Eve every year and shook the pastor's hand on the way out and said nothing else." He folded his hands on the desk. "Whatever else he was, I couldn't tell you. He kept himself very close." Ruth took the envelope and put it in her purse. "Can I go to the property today?" "I'll draw you a map. It's 11 miles out. The road gets rough the last 2 miles, but your car should manage it." At the door, she paused. "Did he have anyone? At the end?" Bernard was already back at his desk. He looked up. "A woman named Dorothea Sims. Dot. She lives on the adjacent parcel. Been there 40 years. She checked on him. Brought food sometimes. She was with him at the end." He picked up his pen. "She knows you're coming. She'll probably be there before you." The road turned to gravel after the county highway, and then turned to something that was less road than the memory of road. 2 ruts through pale grass, frozen solid in November. The car's undercarriage scraping the ridge between them at intervals. Ruth drove with both hands on the wheel and her jaw tight, and thought about Marcus's voice saying, "Don't spend money you don't have," and drove anyway. The property revealed itself the way unwelcome truths tend to, gradually, then all at once. First, the fence line came into view, post and wire strung across the hills, solid if not new. Then the gate, iron, hinged, standing open in the way of a gate that hadn't been closed in some time. Then the driveway, such as it was, curving through brown grass toward a cluster of structures that resolved as she got closer into something she recognized as a farmstead, the one that had been arguing with time for several decades and was not clearly winning. The farmhouse stood 2 stories, wood frame, painted white in a previous century. The paint had gone the color of old bone and was peeling in long strips that flapped in the wind like something trying to signal for help. 2 of the ground floor windows had been covered from inside with what looked like cardboard. The porch sagged at its far end. The chimney still stood, on a rusted weather vane on the roof peak. A rooster, she thought, though it was hard to tell. turned without conviction in the November wind. Behind the house, the barn. It was enormous. That was the first thing. She hadn't expected enormous. The county assessor's language, one hay barn, approximately 4,000 square feet, had sounded like a modest statement of a modest fact. But the building that rose behind the farmhouse was not modest in any dimension. It was as long as a city block and as tall as a 3-story building. Its gambrel roof arching against the gray Montana sky with the patient authority of a structure that had been here before everything else and intended to remain after. The boards had gone silver with age. The big rolling door on the south face hung slightly open, pulled a few feet to the side and left there, and through the gap, Ruth could see only darkness. She parked beside a pickup truck she didn't recognize and got out into air that was cold enough to feel personal about it. A woman was coming around the side of the barn, 70s, broad through the shoulders, wearing a canvas work coat and rubber barn boots, and a wool hat pulled low over a face that had been weathered by decades of wind into something that now looked like it had been assembled for durability rather than comfort. She walked with a slight list to the left, but no apology for it. She looked at Ruth the way people do when they've already formed an opinion and are waiting to see if they were right. "You're Ruth," she said. Not a question. "Yes. Dorothea?" "Dot. Everyone calls me Dot." She extended a hand, grip firm and brief. "You look like your mother. Something around the eyes." That landed somewhere Ruth hadn't expected. She made herself breathe. "You knew my mother?" "Met her once, at Earl's. Must have been, 1990 thereabouts. She brought you along. You were maybe 12. You spent the whole visit exploring the barn." Dot's expression shifted briefly into something Ruth couldn't quite read. "Earl watched you do it. Didn't say a word. But he watched." Ruth looked at the barn. She had no memory of this visit, which was strange, because the barn alone seemed like the kind of thing a 12-year-old would remember. What did he think? Could you tell? With Earl, you could usually tell what he thought about something by whether he said anything about it afterward. He didn't talk about most things. He talked about you. Dot paused. Not often, and not much. But he mentioned you. Over the years. She turned toward the barn. "You want to see it?" The inside of the barn smelled of old hay and cold, and the particular dust of a place that had not been disturbed recently. It was as enormous inside as its exterior promised, a vast, dim space framed by hand-hewn timbers that Ruth could tell, even in the low light, were something remarkable. Old-growth Douglas fir, probably, 8 inches square, fitted together with the kind of joinery that didn't happen at lumber yards anymore. The rafters arched overhead at intervals, and between them she could see the underside of the gambrel roof boards, pale with age, sound as far as she could tell. A few shafts of thin afternoon light cut through gaps where board had shrunk away from board over the decades, illuminating drifting motes of dust. The floor was wide plank fir, dark, with decades of absorbed moisture and grime, scattered with old straw and chaff. Along the east wall, the remnants of cattle stanchions still stood, a dozen empty wooden frames bolted to a feed rail. Horse stalls occupied the west wall, 4 of them, the doors half rotted, but the frames still square. An old tack room near the south door stood open, empty of everything except a pair of rusted bits hanging from a nail and a calendar on the wall from 1987, featuring a photograph of the Grand Tetons. Above it all, the hayloft. accessed by a ladder on the north wall, steep-railed, climbing into the upper half of the barn's interior, where the light was even dimmer and the smell of old hay was stronger, concentrated by the low overhead clearance under the gambrel peak. It was, in every observable sense, exactly what Marcus had said it was. On an empty barn, old, solidly built, not without a kind of austere dignity in its structure, but containing nothing of value that she could see. No equipment, no stored goods. Nothing at all, in fact, except the structure itself and the traces left by animals and weather and time. Everything he had of value he sold off years ago, Dot said from behind her. Ruth had almost forgotten the older woman was there. Equipment went piece by piece, starting in the late 90s, when he stopped running cattle. He ran Herefords for 30 years. Good herd. But the last of them went in 2002, and he sold the machinery the following year. Practical man. Didn't keep what he wasn't using. A pause. Or so people thought. Ruth turned. What does that mean? Dot looked at her steadily. He told me once. This was maybe 5 years ago. He said, Dot, there's a difference between what a person shows and what a person keeps. I asked him what he meant. He said, You'll understand when it's time to understand. She spread her hands. I assumed he was talking about philosophy. Earl read a lot of philosophy. She looked up at the hayloft, and something in her expression was careful in the way of someone who had been careful about this particular thing for a long time. He said to tell you the barn deserves more than a glance. His words. He planned this, Ruth said. All of this. He knew what he was doing. Earl always knew what he was doing, even when nobody else did. Dot pulled her coat tighter. I'll leave you to it. Come to my place when you're done. I'm the yellow farmhouse, 1/4 mile north. I've got soup on. She looked at Ruth once more, that same unreadable expression. So don't let it get dark while you're up in the loft. The light up there's tricky. Then she walked out, and Ruth was alone. She stood in the middle of the barn floor for a while, hands in her coat pockets, and let herself feel whatever she was feeling, which was a complicated mixture of foolish and stubborn and desperately, quietly hopeful, in a way she hadn't allowed herself to be in 18 months. Since Dale. Since the diagnosis and the treatment and the 3 a.m. conversations in the hospital room where they'd talked about everything except the thing that was actually happening. And then the thing had happened anyway. And now she was standing in a dead man's barn in Montana with $112 in her checking account and a manila envelope she wasn't supposed to open yet. She started with the ground floor. Systematic. The way her years at the front desk had taught her to work, left to right, near to far, noting what she saw without deciding what it meant until she'd seen all of it. The stanchions were old, but the bolts were sound. The stall doors needed replacing, but the framing was true. The tack room floor was solid underfoot. The south door's rolling mechanism still worked, just stiff. She pushed it open another 3 feet and let the last of the November light in. Then she climbed the ladder to the hayloft. The ladder was steeper than it looked, and the rungs were worn smooth from decades of use, but they were solid, not punky, properly mortised into the rails. She tested each one before committing weight. Her arms ached by the top rung. She was not a woman who'd been climbing barn ladders lately, and she pulled herself onto the loft floor, breathing harder than she'd have liked. The loft stretched the full length of the barn, maybe 80 feet, ceiling rising at the center peak to perhaps 15 feet at the apex of the gambrel, sloping down toward the eaves on each side. The floor up here was the same wide plank fur as below, or mostly, she noticed, as she stood and let her eyes adjust to the dimmer light, that there was a variation in the planking about 2/3 of the way toward the far wall. A section of floor, maybe 12 feet wide, and running the full width of the loft, where the boards were slightly different from the rest. Not a different color exactly. They'd gone the same silver gray with age, but a different width, so the surrounding boards were wide, 12 or 14 inches, old-growth width. The section in the middle was narrower, 8-inch boards, she estimated, which meant they'd been milled later, much later, judging by the grain. She'd learned enough about old buildings from Dale, who'd spent weekends restoring a 1940s bungalow they'd bought before Marcus was born, to know that a patch like this usually meant one of two things: rot repair, where the original boards had failed and been replaced, or intentional alteration, where the original floor had been opened up and resealed. She walked toward the section carefully, testing each board with her weight before trusting it fully, the way Barnard's note had made her inclined to trust nothing prematurely. The replacement boards were solid underfoot. No bounce, no give. Whoever had put them in had done it well. She crouched down and ran her palm along the surface. The boards were smooth, drier than the surrounding floor, which made sense. Less age meant less absorbed moisture. But there was something else. Along the seam, where the newer boards met the older ones, she felt a very slight, almost imperceptible, draft. The smallest breath of cold air moving upward through the gap. She pressed her palm flat against the floor and held still. There was space beneath this section, not the crawl space beneath the first floor. She was up in the loft, 15 feet above the ground. A space like this, here, would have to be intentional, built into the structure of the loft itself, between the loft floor and the ceiling of the ground level below. Ruth sat back on her heels and looked at the section of floor. Her heart was doing something she wasn't sure was healthy. She moved along the board slowly, pressing at intervals, until her fingers found a place near the eastern edge of the section, where one board, the third from the end, didn't quite sit flush with its neighbor. A hair's width. Less. Enough for a fingernail, maybe, if she pressed hard. She pressed hard. The board shifted, just slightly, a small lateral movement that was not the settling of old wood, but the movement of wood designed to move. She dug her fingers under the edge and pulled, and felt resistance, and pulled harder, and the board came up an inch, then 2, revealing beneath it the curved top of something iron, an iron ring, old, blackened, set into a wooden plate that was flush with the surrounding boards. A handle, a pull. Ruth Calloway sat on the floor of her dead great-uncle's hayloft in eastern Montana, with her fingers touching a cold iron ring hidden beneath a board that had been put there by someone who had gone to considerable trouble to make sure no one would find it without knowing to look. And she thought of what Dot had said. There's a difference between what a person shows and what a person keeps. She thought of the manila envelope in her purse, downstairs, leaning against the passenger seat of her car. The one she wasn't supposed to open until she'd been inside the barn. She looked at the ring. She looked at the fading November light coming through the gaps in the barn boards. Dot's warning threading back through her mind. Don't let it get dark while you're in the loft. The light up there is tricky, and understood that she had perhaps an hour before the sky outside went from gray to black, and she'd be unable to see anything up here without a flashlight she hadn't brought. She made herself stand, made herself walk back to the ladder, made herself descend each rung carefully despite the fact that everything in her chest was pulling upward, back toward that ring, toward the draft of cold air that rose from below it, toward the question that Earl Whitmore had apparently spent the last years of his life arranging for her to ask. Outside, the cold hit her face like a correction. She crossed the gravel to her car and opened the passenger door and took out the manila envelope with her name written on it, in Earl's angular hand. She sat in the driver's seat with the door open and the interior light on and broke the seal on the envelope. Inside was a letter. 7 pages, handwritten on lined paper, the handwriting dense and deliberate, and occasionally difficult to make out where his hands had evidently begun to fail him near the end. At the top of the first page he had written simply, "Ruth, I'm sorry I waited so long. There wasn't a right time, and then time ran out, the way it does. What you found in the loft is the floor. You'll need to come back in the morning with a proper light and whatever tools you can borrow from Dot. She knows where I keep them. Don't try to lift the door alone. It's heavier than it looks. Everything is heavier than it looks. That's the first thing to know. The second thing you need to know is why." Ruth lowered the letter to her lap and looked at the barn. In the failing light, it had gone from silver to something close to black, its enormous shape rising against a sky that had decided to produce stars after all, sharp and cold and indifferent. The weather vane on the farmhouse roof squeaked once in the wind and was still. She had driven 14 hours. She had $112 in her account and $180,000 in debt, and a mortgage company that had sent a second, formal notice last week. She had a son who thought she'd wasted a tank of gas on a sentimental errand, and a daughter-in-law who'd texted "love you" in a way that meant something else entirely. She had 7 pages from a man who had pressed a soft $20 bill into her hand at her mother's funeral and called her mother the best of all of us, and who had apparently spent the better part of 94 years keeping a secret that he'd decided, in the end, to give to her. She put the letter back in the envelope without reading further. Not tonight. In the morning, with proper light. She drove the quarter-mile to Dot's yellow farmhouse, where soup was on the stove, and the windows glowed warm against the Montana dark, and tried to sit still and eat and breathe normally, while inside her chest, something that had been frozen for 18 months was beginning, very slowly, to crack open. She slept in Earl's farmhouse that night because Dot insisted, and because the alternative was the Motel 6 in Billings, which was an hour and a half away and felt like a surrender. Dot had a key and had been into the farmhouse recently, enough to know the heat worked and the water ran, and which of the bedrooms had a functioning lamp. The smell inside was old paper and dust and something herbal, sage, maybe, dried, and the walls in the main room were lined with bookshelves that ran floor to ceiling and held several hundred volumes, spines worn from use, organized in a system that Ruth couldn't decode. She lay in the dark with the manila envelope on the nightstand and didn't open it. She'd promised herself morning, with proper light, and she was a woman who kept the promises she made to herself because at this particular point in her life, those were the only ones she had full control over. But she lay awake for a long time, in the house that now belonged to her, on 200 acres of Montana scrubland that everyone who loved her had told her was worth nothing, thinking about an iron ring in a hayloft floor and the cold breath of air that had risen from below it, and a letter that began, "I am sorry I waited so long." Outside, the wind moved across the grass. The weather vane on the roof made its small, complaining sound. Somewhere out on the property, an animal moved in the dark, something that rustled and was quiet and rustled again. Ruth Calloway did not sleep until nearly 3 a.m, and when she did, she dreamed of her mother at 11, standing in a hay-smelling barn with a child beside her, and a solitary old man in the shadows, watching them both with the careful attention of someone who had already decided what he was going to do, and was only waiting for the right person to be ready to receive it. Morning came gray and sharp. She had Earl's letter open on the kitchen table before the coffee was done brewing, a flashlight and a borrowed crowbar from Dot's tool room on the chair beside her, and through the frost-rimed kitchen window, she could already see the barn's enormous silhouette, waiting against the pale eastern sky. She read the letter once, quickly, to understand the shape of it. Then she put on her coat and her gloves and her boots and walked out into the cold, toward what Earl Whitmore had spent 94 years keeping, and what he had decided, at the end, that she was the only one ready to find. The letter was 7 pages. Ruth had read the first paragraph the night before and stopped herself. The way you stop yourself before the last chapter of a book you're not ready to be finished with. Now she sat at Earl's kitchen table in the gray morning light, with coffee going cold beside her, and read all of it, slowly, the way she suspected Earl had written it, not in a rush, not performing anything, simply trying to say what was true before time ran out for saying it. He'd started with an apology, not for what was in the barn, but for the decades of silence before it. "Ruth, I want to explain before you find it rather than after, because I know what it looks like when you find it without explanation. It looks like a crime. And it wasn't a crime, or rather, it was a crime that ceased to be a crime 50 years before I die, which I think reasonable people can agree amounts to the same thing as not a crime. Though I understand the government might disagree, I am 92 years old, and I have made my peace with the government. And She smiled despite herself. The sentence trailed off there, incomplete, as if Earl had paused to consider whether peace was quite the right word, and decided to move on without resolving it. He'd been born in 1929. That was the first fact he wanted her to have. Born in 1929 in eastern Montana, fourth son of a wheat farmer who lost the farm in 1933 when the bank called the loan and the drought took the crop, and there was nothing left to do but pack what fit in a truck and drive west, the way everyone was driving west that year, toward the rumor of something better. Except Earl's father had not driven west. Earl's father had stopped the truck 1 mile from the property line and sat behind the wheel for 40 minutes while Earl and his brothers waited in the truck bed and didn't speak because children knew, even then, when silence was the only appropriate thing. And then Earl's father had turned the truck around and driven back to the farm. He told the bank to come and take it if they wanted it. He said that. I was 4 years old, and I watched him say it to a man in a suit who drove out from Billings. And the man in the suit looked at my father like he was dangerous or crazy. And my father was neither. He was just a man who had built something and was not willing to hand it over without being made to. They made him, eventually. But it took another year, and 2 more men in suits, and a sheriff I didn't recognize. My father watched them load our things onto a wagon, and he didn't say another word. but I remember his face. And I decided when I was 4 years old that I would never have a face like that. That I would never be in a position where a man in a suit could take what I had built. I spent the rest of my life arranging not to be. The family had rebuilt slowly, taking ranch work wherever they could find it, living in a series of other people's bunkhouses for nearly a decade before Earl's father saved enough to buy back a smaller parcel. 60 acres, no farmhouse, just land, and begin again. Earl had gone to work at 12, proper work, cowhand work, and had never really stopped. By 20, he was running fence crews across 3 counties. By 25, he had a reputation as someone who knew cattle and knew machinery and could be trusted with both. In 1933, when Earl was 4, Franklin Roosevelt had signed Executive Order 6102. Ruth had heard of it vaguely, something about gold, the Depression, but the details had lived at the edges of her knowledge, and she'd never had occasion to bring them to the center. Earl brought them to the center now, in the careful language of a man who'd spent 60 years being quietly furious about something most people had forgotten. The order required every person in the United States to surrender their gold coins, gold bullion, and gold certificates to the Federal Reserve by May 1st, 1933. In exchange, they would receive paper dollars at the rate of $20.67 per troy ounce. 6 months later, the government reset the price of gold to $35 per ounce, which meant that anyone who had surrendered their gold had immediately lost 40% of its value. They called it a necessary measure to stabilize the economy. What it was, in plain language, was the government confiscating the savings of people who had been sensible enough to hold them in something real, and compensating them with paper they could print as much of as they liked. My father had already lost everything by then, so there was nothing to surrender. But I never forgot. And when I was old enough to acquire something worth protecting, I made certain I protected it differently than my father had been able to. He had started buying gold in 1955. Legally, by then, the private ownership of gold had been gradually restored and fully legalized again in 1974. But Earl had started before full legalization, which was the part that required explanation. Not large amounts, never anything that would draw attention. He'd worked a gold claim in the mountains west of here for 17 years, beginning in 1958, a legal placer claim on Forest Service land, modest production, properly reported for tax purposes. The nuggets and flake gold he extracted he kept rather than sold, storing them in coffee cans in his truck cab until he'd accumulated enough to smelt into bars, which he did himself, in a setup he'd built in the barn, and which he stored in a place he was going to tell her about now. The Hayloft floor was my design, built in the autumn of 1962. I had read about similar constructions and histories of the Underground Railroad, and thought the principle sound. A false floor over a sealed chamber, and the access concealed beneath boards that matched the surrounding floor, closely enough that no one who didn't know to look would look. The chamber below is 6 feet deep, 9 feet wide, and runs the full width of the loft, 14 feet. I poured the concrete floor myself, one section at a time, carrying materials up the ladder in a bucket over 3 weeks in October when the weather was clear and no one came by. I lined the walls with 8-inch cinder block, sealed against moisture. Then I replaced the loft floor above it with new planking, narrower boards, which I know is detectable to a careful eye, and which I decided was acceptable because the only people who would be looking carefully were people who already had reason to look, and I intended to leave before anyone had reason. He had left something else in the chamber, and not just gold. She would find a wooden crate, he wrote, sealed with wax. Inside the crate were documents. She needed to read the documents before she decided anything. He was very specific about that. What you find will raise questions about what you owe and to whom. I have tried to answer those questions for you as best I could with what I had. But I am 92, and some things I could not finish. I need you to finish them. I am asking this of you specifically because you are the one who explored this barn at 12 years old with the same attention a person gives to something they sense matters, and because your mother told me once that you were a woman who could be trusted with difficulty. She said it like she meant it. I believed her. Be brave, Ruth. The weight of it is real, but it's not more than you can carry. So I know, because I carried it alone for 60 years, and I was never as strong as you look. Ruth set the letter down, pressed both palms flat on the table, breathed. Then she put on her coat and picked up the flashlight and the crowbar and went to get Dot. Dot listened to the summary of the letter without interrupting. They were walking across the frost-stiff grass toward the barn, their breath clouding in the cold morning air. The sky overhead gone from gray to a thin, pale blue that suggested the sun intended to appear eventually, but was making no promises. When Ruth finished, Dot was quiet for a moment. He told me once, she said finally, that the barn was the most important thing on the property, and I should never let anyone inside it who hadn't earned the right. I thought he meant sentimentally. She looked at the barn's silver face. Earl was not a sentimental man. Did you ever wonder? I wondered for 40 years. And then I decided that what Earl kept was Earl's business, and when he was ready to make it someone else's business, he would. He always did things in the right order, just not always on anyone else's timeline. Dot held the barn door while Ruth ducked inside. He talked about you more these last few years. When he knew he was getting close, he'd say, "Dot, do you think she'll come?" And I'd say, "Earl, I don't know the woman." And he'd say, "No, but I do. She'll come." Ruth climbed the loft ladder with the flashlight in her coat pocket, Dot following with the ease of a woman who'd been climbing barn ladders since before Ruth was born. At the top, in the fuller light of morning coming through the east-facing gaps in the barn boards, the variation in the loft floor was more visible than it had been the evening before. The narrower boards, the slight difference in the grain, the section that sat just barely apart from the rest. She found the board with the iron ring again immediately, lifted it out and set it aside. The ring was 6 inches across, wrought iron, bolted through a wooden plate perhaps 2 inches thick. Below the plate, visible now in the flashlight beam, was the top surface of a hatch. Heavy planking, maybe 3 inches thick, fitted into a frame that was set into the loft floor. A second ring on the opposite edge of the hatch, handles for lifting, 2-person work, which was why Earl had told her to bring help. "Ready?" Ruth said. "Been ready for 40 years, Dot said. They each took a ring, lifted. The hatch was heavier than Ruth had expected, and lighter than Earl had suggested, which meant Earl had been a conservative man, even about practical warnings. It came up on a pair of heavy hinges along one edge and swung back to rest against the loft floor with a sound like a held breath finally released. Cold air rose from below, dark and still and carrying the mineral smell of concrete and something else, a dry, metallic scent that Ruth couldn't immediately name. She shone the flashlight down. A ladder, iron rungs set into the concrete wall, descended 6 feet to a poured concrete floor. The chamber below was exactly as Earl had described it. 9 feet wide, 14 feet across, cinder block walls sealed with what looked like a skim coat of hydraulic cement. No moisture damage, no intrusion of any kind. The air was cold and completely still, sealed from the outside world since the last time Earl had climbed down these rungs, whenever that had been. And the floor of the chamber was covered in wooden crates. Ruth counted as best she could from above. 12, 15, more in the far corners that the flashlight didn't reach clearly. Wooden crates of varying sizes, sealed, stacked in some places 2 or 3 high. And among the crates, in no particular order, a dozen or more burlap sacks with their tops tied with twine, sitting heavy and low on the concrete the way sacks of sand sit. She climbed down the iron rungs. Her boots hit the concrete floor, and the sound of it echoed off the sealed walls in a way that made the space feel larger than it was, and also very specifically real. Not a dream, not a mistake, not a story she was telling herself in the car with her hands shaking on the steering wheel. Real concrete under her boots, real crates, real weight in the burlap sacks when she crouched beside the nearest one and pressed her palm against it and felt the particular heavy give of something dense and hard shifting against itself in small pieces. She untied the twine on the nearest sack and opened the top. Gold coins, hundreds of them, loose, lying against each other with the soft musical sound of metal on metal. American gold eagles mostly, and older pieces she didn't immediately recognize. Large coins with an eagle on one face, a woman striding with a torch on the other, a date she had to squint to read. 1914. Another. 1908. Pre-confiscation coins, survivors of FDR's order, kept hidden for 60 years, and then 60 more. She opened the nearest wooden crate with the crowbar. Inside, nested in what had once been newspaper, the paper brown and fragile now, crumbling at the edges, were gold bars. She lifted one. It was roughly the size of a thick paperback book and weighed, she estimated, somewhere between 20 and 30 pounds. On the top face, a maker's mark stamped into the surface, a small eagle, and beneath it, numbers and letters that meant nothing to her immediately, but which she understood represented assay information, purity grade, lot identification. She set the bar down carefully on the concrete floor beside her knee. She was breathing through her mouth. She hadn't noticed when she'd started doing that. Ruth. Dot's voice from above. Careful. Wait, what is it? Ruth looked up through the hatch at the older woman's silhouette against the loft light. She tried twice to say it, and the words didn't form correctly the first time, so she stopped and breathed and tried again. Gold, she said. It's gold. All of it. Dot, there must be. She looked at the crates, the sacks, the sealed corners of the chamber she hadn't gotten to yet, and the number that formed in her mind was so large it seemed to belong to a different category of thought than the ones she normally used. There's an enormous amount of gold in this room. A silence from above. Then Dot said, in a voice utterly devoid of surprise, "Well, he always did say the barn was the most important thing on the property." The wooden crate in the far corner was sealed differently from the rest. Wax, as Earl had described, pressed into the gaps between the lid and the box, with a thoroughness that suggested he'd wanted this one to be airtight. Ruth pried it open with more care than she'd given the others. Inside, no gold. Instead, documents. Organized, labeled, stored in sealed plastic bags that Earl had apparently purchased from some archival supply company and dated in black marker. The bags were stacked in neat rows, each one labeled on the outside in his angular hand. She lifted out the first stack and carried it up the ladder into the light. She and Dot spread them across the loft floor. Tax records going back to 1958. The placer mining claim documentation, filed correctly, renewed annually until 2001, when Earl's knees had finally made the mountain work impossible. Purchase receipts for gold bought from licensed dealers, all properly dated, some most from after 1974, when private ownership was fully legal, some from the years before, when it existed in a legal gray zone that Earl apparently had navigated carefully. Insurance documents, gold listed as stored property on a policy that Earl had quietly canceled in 2018, she noticed, when he must have understood that canceling a policy was less conspicuous than maintaining one on assets that no longer existed in any official record. And one more bag, thicker than the rest, labeled in different ink, slightly shakier writing. More recent, she thought. Inside, a spiral-bound notebook, its cover worn, its pages filled with Earl's handwriting in the same careful script as the letter, but smaller, denser, covering decades of entries. And beneath the notebook, 9 sealed envelopes, each one bearing a name. Well, she didn't recognize most of the names, but she recognized, with the cold clarity that arrives when something clicks into place that you didn't know was out of alignment, that these envelopes were the part of Earl's letter he'd called the documents that would raise questions about what she owed and to whom. She opened the notebook first. Earl Whitmore had begun keeping the notebook in 1943, when he was 14 years old, and his older brother, James, had been drafted. The first entry was a list, written in a 14-year-old's hand, more rounded, less controlled than the later writing, of things James had left behind that Earl was taking care of. The second entry was a week later, and recorded the date James shipped out. There was no third entry for 3 months, and when it resumed, it did so not about James, but about a family. October 12th, 1943. 3 men came to see Father today, drove out from Billings. Father knew one of them slightly. His name is Geller. He owns the feed supply in town, or his family does. The other 2 I did not recognize. They spoke to Father for a long time in the kitchen, and I was not invited, but I stayed near the door because I knew something serious was being discussed. Their name, as I understood it, is Benedek. They are from Hungary originally. They have family in Europe who are in danger. They converted everything they had into gold before leaving Europe 5 years ago, and they have been afraid to keep it in a bank and afraid to convert it back into dollars because of something they would not explain fully. They want a place to keep it. Somewhere no bank can reach it and no government can confiscate it. Father said he knew just the man. Ruth turned pages. The entries came irregularly, weeks apart, sometimes months, and they documented, in Earl's increasingly precise handwriting, a series of arrangements that he had entered into between 1943 and 1951, with 7 different families. All of them European, most of them Jewish, all of them survivors of something Ruth didn't need him to name to understand. They had come to Montana by various routes, through various connections, to a man who had a hidden place and the reputation for keeping what he was given. They had left gold. Each family had an envelope with their name on it, a letter from Earl, and documentation of what they had left and when. November 1943, Benedek family. 34 gold bars, 10 ounces each, 24 carat. Receipt signed by myself and by David Benedek. Agreed terms. Held in trust. High returnable on demand to David Benedek or his designated heirs. No charge for storage. This is not a business arrangement. This is the right thing, and I am old enough to know that. He had been 14 years old when he wrote that. Ruth read it twice. 6 of the 7 families had never come back. Not in the years immediately after the war, not in the decades that followed. Earl had looked for them. The notebook documented his searches. Letters written, responses received or not received. Lists of names checked against survivor registries. Addresses attempted. Some families had been destroyed entirely. Others had scattered to Israel, to Argentina, to South Africa, and then scattered further. And the original members who had made the arrangement with Earl's father were gone, from when their children didn't know to look for anything in eastern Montana, and Earl had been left holding gold that wasn't his and couldn't find the people it belonged to, and couldn't in conscience spend it or sell it or treat it as his own. 1978. I found one of the Sobo children. She goes by Susan now, lives in Toronto. She was 3 years old when her parents left this gold with father. She does not know. I have written the letter 4 times. I cannot send it. How do you write to a woman who does not know she is missing anything and tell her she is? What if it brings more pain than comfort? What if finding out what her parents carried out of Europe and entrusted to a stranger is harder to bear than not knowing? I don't know the right answer. I'm keeping the letter. Maybe I will know someday. He had never known. The notebook said so plainly, near the end, in the shakiest of his handwriting. A page dated 2021. I ran out of courage on this one. I was brave enough to keep it, and not brave enough to return it. I'm sorry for that. I'm leaving the letters and the documentation for whoever comes next, and trusting them to do what I couldn't. I believe that's Ruth. She was the right kind of child. I think she became the right kind of adult. Ruth sat on the loft floor for a long time with the notebook in her hands and did not speak. Outside, the wind had picked up, pushing against the barn boards with a sound like breathing. Dot sat beside her without touching her and without speaking, which was exactly right. Finally, one family came back, Ruth said. She'd read ahead. The Gellers. I know the Gellers, Dot said quietly. 3rd generation. They run the hardware store in town. Earl returned their gold in 1987. It's documented. She turned to the page. 40 years of waiting, and they came back, and he gave them everything, and they used it to buy the hardware store. She paused. The letter in this envelope, the one with their name on it, it's a letter of confirmation. Earl held a receipt all those years. Martin Geller is 62 years old, Dot said. His grandfather came to this country with nothing. He's told that story his whole life. He doesn't know the rest of it. A pause. He probably should. Ruth put the notebook down carefully, looked at the 8 remaining envelopes. 8 names, 8 families, and decades of Earl's failed searching already documented, already dead-ended, to already made as complete as a man alone with letters and library indexes and eventually the early internet could make them. He'd done the groundwork. He'd left her the foundation. And he was right. She would need to finish it. But first, she needed to understand what she was working with. And for that, she needed someone who knew more than she did. She climbed back down to the chamber, counted crates, counted sacks, measured the chamber dimensions against Earl's documented figures, and made rough calculations based on what she knew about gold density and current pricing, which was not much, but enough to produce a number that she wrote on the back of her hand in pen, and then stared at for a full minute without blinking. Then she climbed back out, walked across the frozen grass to Earl's farmhouse, sat at the kitchen table, and called Bernard Halley. "I need an appraiser," she said when he answered. "A gold appraiser. Someone who can come to the property and doesn't talk to the press." Bernard was quiet for 3 seconds. "Ruth, what did you find?" "I'd rather you see it." Another pause. "I'll be there in an hour." He arrived in 50 minutes, which told her he'd driven faster than usual. He came up the hayloft ladder without being asked, looked into the chamber with the flashlight Ruth handed him, stood there for almost a full minute before he said anything. "Earl Whitmore," he said finally, in the tone of a man revising his entire understanding of a client he'd had for 14 years. "He was very private," Ruth said. "He was the most private man I've ever represented, and I work in a town of 400 people. Bernard handed the flashlight back. "I know an assayer in Billings, Gerald Trout, retired from the U.S. Mint, does private appraisal work, extremely discreet. I've used him twice for estate work, and he has never once said a word to anyone." He pulled out his phone. "I'm going to call him now, and then I'm going to call my nephew, who practices federal property law in Helena, because there are going to be legal questions about this that I am not equipped to answer alone, and I'd rather have them answered before anyone else starts asking them." "The foreign families," Ruth said. "The gold that isn't Earl's." Bernard looked at her. "You found the documentation. And the envelopes, and the notebook." She handed him Earl's letter. He read it standing in the loft, lips moving slightly at the harder passages, and when he finished, his expression had gone to something between admiration and grief. "He never told me any of this," Bernard said. "He didn't tell anyone. That was the point." She held out her hand for the letter, and he returned it. "How much trouble am I in?" Bernard considered this with the care of a man who understood that a hasty answer was worse than a slow one. "Legally, the gold Earl mined himself and purchased legitimately is yours. Clear and straightforward. The gold held in trust for the foreign families is more complex. It depends on whether living heirs can be identified, whether they can prove claim, what the statute of limitations looks like for a trust arrangement this old, and how the government wants to characterize the original arrangement." He put his phone away. "The fact that Earl documented everything meticulously works in your favor. He wasn't hiding a crime. He was hiding assets from a government that had once confiscated assets, and he was holding property in trust for people who needed it, kept safe. Context matters enormously. And if a living heir shows up and says their family's gold is in that chamber, then we give it to them," Ruth said. "That's not a legal question." Bernard looked at her for a moment. "No," he agreed. "I suppose it isn't." Gerald Trout arrived the following morning in a truck that was older than his retirement and carried equipment in the bed that he handled with the reverent precision of a surgeon. He was in his 70s, thin, so with wire-rimmed glasses and the quiet, methodical manner of a man who had spent 30 years working with the most precisely valued substance on Earth and had developed very specific opinions about how things should be done. He spent 4 hours in the chamber. He weighed every bar, documented every coin, tested samples with portable XRF equipment that told him the purity of each piece down to 3 decimal places. He cataloged the maker's marks and the assay numbers and cross-referenced them against databases on his laptop with the thoroughness of someone who understood that provenance was not a bureaucratic formality, but the difference between a clear title and a court proceeding. Ruth waited on the loft floor above. Dot had brought a thermos of coffee and 2 cups, and they sat against the barn wall in the thin November sun that came through the east-facing gaps and drank it without talking much, in the comfortable silence of 2 women who had decided they trusted each other and saw no reason to fill the space with noise just because it was there. When Gerald climbed back up the ladder, he pushed his glasses up his nose, opened his laptop on the loft floor, and turned it so Ruth could see the screen. A number. Total gross weight. Total estimated value at current market price, conservatively assessed. A range, with a floor and a ceiling. Ruth looked at it again. The floor of the range was $271 million. The ceiling was $312 million. The midpoint, Gerald had highlighted, $291 million. And next to it in parentheses, a note, subject to full provenance verification and legal status of trust holdings. Working estimate only. "This is right?" Ruth said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. "It's conservative," Gerald said. "Gold markets move. If anything, I've underestimated the numismatic value of the pre-confiscation coins. Some of those pieces are quite rare in this condition and would command a premium above spot price at auction." He closed the laptop. "Mrs. Calloway, I've appraised a lot of private gold holdings over 30 years. This is the largest I've personally encountered." He looked at the hatch in the floor. "Earl Whitmore accumulated this over about 50 years of legitimate acquisition, based on what Mr. Halley tells me about the mining records. That's extraordinary patience. He grew up watching his family lose everything to a bank," Ruth said, "and then to the government. He was 4 years old." Gerald was quiet for a moment. "Well," he said. He made his point. She called Marcus that evening. She'd been composing the call in her head since morning, turning over different approaches. The practical approach, the factual approach, the approach that led with how much she'd missed him and arrived at the news sideways. In the end, she called him while standing on Earl's porch, watching the November dark settle over 200 acres of Montana scrubland. And she said it plainly because she was tired, and plainness was all she had. "Marcus, I need you to come to Montana. Mom, I told you, the barn wasn't empty." She paused. "Earl hid gold in the hayloft, in a sealed chamber under the floor. An appraiser assessed it this morning. Marcus," she stopped, started again. "It's worth somewhere between $271 and $312 million. The silence on the line was the longest she had ever heard from her son. Marcus was not a man given to silences. He filled spaces with words, efficiently, purposefully. It was something Dale had teased him about when he was a teenager, gently, and Marcus had taken the observation seriously and consciously moderated it as an adult. But now there was simply nothing from him for so long that Ruth pulled the phone from her ear and checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "Say that again," Marcus said. His voice was different, stripped of its efficiency. She said it again. with the numbers, with the broad shape of what the documents showed, with the part about the foreign families, which she made sure to include because she wanted him to understand from the beginning that this was not a simple situation, that it had weight and history and obligation woven through it, that the number on Gerald Trout's screen was not the whole story and would not be allowed to become the whole story. When she finished, Marcus said, "Mom, I told you not to go." "I know you did." "I told you it was a barn full of nothing." "Yes." A long breath on the line. "I'll be there tomorrow." His voice had gone quiet in the way it did when he was genuinely affected by something and didn't know how to manage it. "Mom, are you okay?" "I'm sitting on Earl's porch in Montana looking at 200 acres of scrubland that apparently contains about $300 million worth of gold." She thought about it. "I'm something. I'm not sure okay is exactly the right word for it." "I'll get the first flight to Billings," Marcus said. And then, in a voice she hadn't heard from him in a long time, more like the Marcus who was 12 and scraped his knee and tried not to show it. "I'm sorry I told you not to go." "Come tomorrow," Ruth said. "We'll talk about it then." She had 24 hours before the first outside pressure arrived. She'd known it wouldn't be long. Bernard's nephew, Clayton Halley, had driven down from Helena the same day as Gerald Trout, had spent 2 hours reviewing the documentation, and had made very clear that certain notifications were legally required within specific time frames. The IRS, the State Revenue Department, potentially the Treasury, given the historical circumstances around some of the holdings and their relationship to the 1933 confiscation order. And once notifications went in, he'd warned, information would begin to move in ways that were very difficult to control. She'd had 24 hours, and she'd spent most of them in the chamber and at the kitchen table, reading Earl's notebook in full. By the time Marcus arrived in a rental car from Billings, she had read it 3 times and understood the shape of what Earl had tried to do and where he had succeeded and where he had failed and what remained unfinished. Marcus stood at the bottom of the hayloft ladder and looked up into the open hatch and then down into the chamber below and was quiet for a long time. He was 30 years old and looked very much like his father had looked at 30. The same jaw, the same way of standing that suggested he was doing calculations. Except that right now, the calculations seemed to be failing him in the same way all calculations fail when the inputs are outside the range they were designed for. "It's real," he said, "not a question." "Independently appraised," Ruth confirmed. "Bernard's nephew is handling the legal side. There are complications." She showed him the envelopes, the notebook, Earl's letter. She sat with him while he read the same pages she'd read, watched his face move through the same expressions she imagined had crossed hers, and when he got to the part about the 14-year-old boy writing, "This is not a business arrangement. This is the right thing." Marcus put the notebook down and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes for a moment, in the way he did when he was holding something in that he didn't want to show. "He spent 60 years looking for these families," Marcus said, "and didn't find most of them, and left it for you to finish." He looked at her. "For us." She hadn't expected the U.S. It settled something she hadn't known was unsettled. "I'm going to need help," she said. "Real help. Not just legal and financial. Someone who can do genealogical research across 6 countries. Someone who knows how Holocaust restitution organizations work. Someone who understands what it means to contact a family in Israel or Toronto or Buenos Aires and tell them that their grandparents hid gold in Montana in 1943 and it's still here. She folded her hands on the table. I wasn't a claims adjuster. I was a receptionist. I don't know how to do most of that. But you'll learn, Marcus said. It wasn't a question either. I don't have any other choice, Ruth said, and I wouldn't want one. The first vehicle she didn't recognize arrived the following afternoon. A black SUV, out-of-state plates, parking at the gate and waiting there, not coming in. Ruth watched it from the farmhouse window for 20 minutes before it left. An hour later, it was back with a second vehicle beside it. A man got out of the second vehicle and walked to the gate and looked at the property with the proprietary appraisal of someone who was already calculating what he'd do with it once it was his. Bernard called at 4. My phone has rung 11 times today from numbers I don't recognize. Art dealers, a hedge fund representative, 2 different collectors, and someone who identified himself as representing a European consortium and wouldn't specify further. Word is moving. We made required notifications yesterday, Ruth said. That's all we did. Required notifications go into systems that people monitor, Bernard said. People who track large gold holdings, estate filings, IRS notifications above certain thresholds. This is not unexpected. It is, however, fast. A pause. Clayton recommends you don't speak to anyone who arrives without an appointment, and you might want to consider security for the property. Marcus, who had been listening from across the kitchen, was already on his phone, ordering gate locks and motion sensors for overnight delivery from a hardware supplier in Billings. That evening, as they ate the soup Dot had brought over, she arrived with it at 6 without being asked, set it on the stove, and left without a word, which was exactly the kind of neighbor Earl had deserved. A man came to the door. Not the gate, the door. He'd come around through the field, bypassing the fence line, which suggested both preparation and intent. He was in his 50s, expensive coat, the practiced easy confidence of someone accustomed to being allowed into rooms others didn't enter. He said his name was Callister, represented a group of private investors with an interest in historical gold holdings. He'd heard, he said, that Ruth had come into an extraordinary inheritance, and his clients were in a position to offer her an expedited transaction that would spare her the difficulty of navigating the complex legal landscape ahead. They were prepared to move quickly. Cash offer. She could be back in Kansas by the weekend, all of it behind her. Marcus had come to stand in the doorway behind her. Ruth could feel him there without turning around. She studied the man called Callister. His shoes were wrong for the terrain, leather-soled, already ruined by the frost-stiff grass he'd crossed to get here. His coat was right for a city and wrong for November in Montana, which meant he'd come from somewhere warm very recently and hadn't thought through the physical reality of where he was going. A man who hadn't thought through the physical reality of where he was going had almost certainly not thought through the full reality of who he was approaching. "Mr. Callister," Ruth said, "you walked across my field in the dark to knock on my door, uninvited to offer me an expedited transaction. I understand it's irregular, given the circumstances." "Given the circumstances," Ruth said. "You should understand that a woman who drove 14 hours alone to a barn that everyone told her was worthless, and spent the night in a dead man's farmhouse, and lifted a hatch that weighed more than she did, is not a woman who responds well to being managed." She held the door. "I'm not selling anything to anyone until I've fulfilled the obligations that come with what's in that barn. After that, Anything I choose to do will go through my attorney. Bernard Halley. His office is above the hardware store in town. You're welcome to make an appointment." She closed the door. Behind her, Marcus made a sound she recognized after 30 years. A short exhale through the nose. Involuntary. The sound he made when something surprised him into admiration. "I thought you were going to let him talk," he said. "I gave him the whole sentence," Ruth said. "That's more than he gave me." She turned back to the kitchen. "Eat your soup before it gets cold." 3 days later, a woman arrived who was different from the others. She drove a government vehicle, a plain, dark sedan, on federal plates, and she came to the front gate at 10 in the morning and called Bernard Halley's office before she knocked, which was either courtesy or a signal that she knew how this worked and wanted Ruth to know she knew. Her name was Agent Sandra Reyes, Department of Treasury, Office of Foreign Assets Control. She had a badge and an appointment, and the manner of someone who understood that she was walking into a situation that required more patience than pressure. She sat at Earl's kitchen table and declined coffee, and explained, clearly and without drama, that the Treasury had flagged the estate filing because of the historical nature of some of the gold holdings and their possible relationship to Executive Order 6102. There were questions she needed Ruth to answer, not accusations. Questions. The distinction mattered, and she wanted Ruth to understand it. Clayton Halley sat beside Ruth through the entire interview. Ruth answered what she could and deferred the rest to Clayton, who had spent the previous 3 days becoming one of the foremost amateur experts on the legal history of the 1933 gold confiscation order in the state of Montana. The documentation Earl had kept, Clayton had already concluded, was almost certainly sufficient to establish legitimate provenance for the bulk of what was in the chamber. The placer mining records were detailed and corroborated by tax filings that matched them exactly. The purchase receipts were dated, signed, and cross-referenced. Earl had been meticulous, not from guilt, but from the conviction of a man who intended, if anyone ever asked, to be able to answer completely. Reyes reviewed the documentation for 2 hours, asked specific questions about specific dates and specific acquisition methods. When she reached the section on the foreign families, the trust arrangements, the envelopes, Earl's documented search for the heirs, she read slowly, and her expression shifted in a way that was small but visible, a recalibration of some kind. "He looked for them for 60 years, she said. "Yes," Ruth said, "and documented every attempt, every letter, every registry search, every dead end." Ruth slid the notebook across the table. "He was 14 years old when he made the first arrangement. He didn't have the resources to search effectively until the internet, and by then most of the people he was looking for were gone." Reyes read 3 more pages of the notebook, then closed it and slid it back. "Mrs. Calloway, I'm going to be honest with you, because I think you've earned it. The Treasury has the authority to complicate this significantly. Depending on how we characterize the pre-1974 holdings, there are arguments we could make." She paused. "We won't be making them. Earl Whitmore didn't hide this gold to defraud anyone. He hid it because the government took his family's farm when he was 4 years old, and then spent another 40 years demonstrating that it wasn't done with the kind of people who built things with their hands in rural Montana." She looked at the notebook. "And he spent 60 years trying to find families that the same government had failed to protect. That context matters, at least to me." Ruth let out a breath she'd been holding since the federal vehicle pulled up to the gate. Now, what happens now? We'll need certified copies of all documentation. The trust holdings for the foreign families will need to go through an OFAC review, which I can expedite given the historical circumstances. My office has a protocol for Holocaust-era asset restitution. It's not the most common thing we do, but we've done it before. For the remainder of the estate. Reyes picked up her pen. You're going to need good lawyers and a lot of patience. But Mrs. Calloway, I don't see a reason this doesn't ultimately belong to you. She capped the pen, and to whoever else Earl Whitmore believed it belonged to. After Reyes left, Ruth sat at the kitchen table alone. Marcus had stepped out to take a call. Dot wasn't there yet. Bernard and Clayton had gone back to town for the afternoon. The farmhouse was quiet except for the wind and the small, creaking language of an old building settling into the cold. She opened Earl's notebook to the last entry. The page dated 2021, 3 years before he died. The shakiest writing. She read the final paragraph again, the one about courage and letters unsent, and trusting her to do what he couldn't. And then she turned to the first blank page after his last entry, and she took the pen from the kitchen counter, and she wrote at the top, Day 1, Ruth Calloway. I am going to find them. Below that, she drew a line across the page, and beneath the line she wrote the first of the 8 names from Earl's envelopes. She didn't know yet how it would go. She didn't know which searches would resolve cleanly and which would dead-end the way Earl's had, or what she would say when she found someone, or whether finding someone would bring comfort or something harder. She didn't know what the lawyers would cost, or how long the Treasury review would take, or what the SUVs parked at her gate represented, in terms of sustained pressure she'd have to continue refusing. What she knew was that a man had spent 94 years keeping a secret that began with his family. Losing a farm and a child deciding that someday, somehow, he would make certain that what was his stayed his and what was other people's got back to them. He had done half of it. He'd kept everything that had been given into his keeping. He'd failed at the returning. Now it was her turn. And Ruth Calloway, who had spent 18 months managing the catastrophe of a life that had been stripped of everything she'd built alongside another person, who had driven 14 hours alone to a barn everyone told her was worthless, who had lifted a hatch in the dark and found not just gold, but the long, patient record of a man trying to do what was right, without anyone telling him how. Ruth Calloway was not the kind of woman who left things unfinished. She uncapped the pen and began to write. The searches took 4 months. Ruth ran them from Earl's kitchen table, which became her table, in Earl's farmhouse, which became her farmhouse, on 200 acres of eastern Montana scrubland that everyone who had loved her had told her was worth nothing, and which turned out to be worth something so large that the number had stopped feeling real approximately 72 hours after Gerald Trout had written it on his laptop screen and turned it toward her. She had help. A genealogist named Petra Voss, who worked out of Vienna and specialized in Holocaust-era asset restitution cases, took one look at Earl's documentation and called it the most complete private record she'd encountered in 20 years of this work. An organization called the Commission for Looted Art in Europe connected Ruth with researchers in Budapest and Prague and Tel Aviv who knew how to move through fractured records, displaced archives, the particular silence that settles over a family's history when the people who held that history were killed. Clayton Halley's office coordinated with the OFAC review, and with Interpol's Works of Art unit, which also, it turned out, kept files on gold. Of the 8 families whose names were on Earl's envelopes, 3 had living documented heirs. The Benedek family, the first name in the notebook, and the ones whose arrival 14-year-old Earl had recorded in October of 1943, had a granddaughter living in Haifa. Her name was Miriam. She was 71 years old and a retired schoolteacher, and she had known her whole life that her grandparents had escaped Hungary with gold and that the gold had gone somewhere and never come back. And she had assumed for decades that it had been stolen or lost or simply consumed by the war the way everything else had been. When Petra called her, Miriam did not speak for almost a full minute. When she did, she said only, "He kept it. All this time, someone kept it." Ruth flew to Tel Aviv in February. She sat across from Miriam Benedek in a small apartment full of plants and family photographs and the smell of coffee. And she set Earl's receipt on the table between them, the one signed in 1943 by a 14-year-old boy in eastern Montana, and watched Miriam's hands tremble as she picked it up. "My grandfather's signature," Miriam said. "I know it from letters. I have letters." She pressed the receipt carefully against her chest for a moment, the way you hold something you never expected to touch. He signed this. He held this. He was alive when he signed this. Ruth didn't say anything. Some moments belonged entirely to the person in them. 2 other families were found. One through a descendant in Toronto who had actually heard rumors of the Montana arrangement from an elderly aunt before she died. And one through a great-nephew in Buenos Aires who had been researching his family's wartime history for a memoir he was writing, and who received the news of the gold's existence with the particular shock of a man who had been looking for a truth he hadn't known was this specific. Both received the gold that had been documented as theirs, transferred through proper legal channels that Clayton and the OFAC had spent 3 months establishing. Neither family had been expecting it. Neither had words for it, at least not immediately. The 5 remaining families could not be traced to living heirs. Petra's team spent 8 weeks on each one and reached the same conclusion Earl had reached through decades of searching. The lines were gone. The gold that had been entrusted to a 14-year-old boy in Montana in 1943 and 1944 by families trying to survive had outlasted the people who left it by 80 years, and there was no one left to give it to. Ruth sat with that for a long time. She'd been prepared for it. Earl's notebook had documented his own reckoning with the same possibility. But being prepared for something difficult and having it arrive are not the same thing. And she gave herself the days she needed to feel the weight of it properly before she decided what to do with it. What she did was this. She contacted the Claims Conference, the international organization that manages Holocaust restitution funds for victims with no surviving heirs, and transferred the 5 families' holdings to their custody, while the gold became part of a fund that provided emergency assistance to elderly Holocaust survivors still living in poverty across 14 countries. Ruth attended the transfer ceremony in New York in March. She sat in the back row and didn't speak to anyone from the press, which was there, and didn't take any photographs. And on the way out, she passed a display on the wall showing the faces of some of the survivors the fund currently supported, old men and old women in small apartments in Ukraine and Romania and Hungary who had outlasted everything and were, in their 90s, still struggling. And she thought of Earl at 4 years old, watching a man in a suit load his family's belongings onto a wagon, and she thought that he would have approved of this, and that was enough. The final certified appraisal, completed in January after the legal status of all holdings had been fully established, put the total value of Ruth's inheritance at $295 million. The figure accounted for the gold returned to the three families, subtracted from the gross estate, and added the numismatic premium on the pre-confiscation coins, which Gerald Trout had been right about. Several of them were extraordinarily rare and drew significant collector interest the moment their existence became known, which happened approximately 48 hours after the Treasury review concluded and the estate filing became public record. The phones rang without stopping for a week. Ruth let them ring. Ridge Creek, Montana, population 412 on the sign, which had been optimistic, turned out to have opinions about what had been sitting under a hayloft on the edge of town for 60 years, and those opinions were varied and occasionally loud. Martin Geller, whose family had gotten their gold back from Earl in 1987 and used it to buy the hardware store, came to the farmhouse on a Thursday with a pie his wife had baked and sat at the kitchen table and said, "My grandfather told me Earl Whitmore was the most honest man in Montana. I thought he was exaggerating." He looked at the table. He wasn't exaggerating. The town council sent a letter proposing a historical marker, which Ruth declined. She didn't want a marker. She wanted the barn to stand as it was, enormous and silver and patient against the Montana sky, keeping its own counsel the way Earl had kept his. Marcus stayed for 6 weeks, but he worked the property alongside Ruth in a way she hadn't expected, physically, practically, helping her assess what the farmhouse needed and what could wait, driving the perimeter fence to catalog what was sound and what wasn't, learning the names of the neighbors and how the roads worked in different weather. He was a man who organized his life around efficiency, and he reorganized it for 6 weeks around something else, being where his mother was. They didn't talk much about the money. They talked about his father, about things Dale had said and done, and believed that Marcus had been too young to absorb fully the first time, and was old enough for now. One evening they sat on the porch in the cold, and Marcus said without preamble, "I told you not to come. I did the math, and I was wrong." "You did the visible math," Ruth said. There was other math. Earl's math. Earl's math." She looked at the barn. 60 years of patience and precision, and not letting anyone tell him what he was looking at before he'd looked for himself. Marcus was quiet. Then, "That's you too." "I know," Ruth said. "I just needed someone to stop arguing long enough for me to remember it." She did not sell the property. This surprised people. The offers were real and large, and came from names she recognized and names she had to look up, and Bernard Halley forwarded them to her with the scrupulous neutrality of a man who understood his job was to inform, not advise on this particular question. Clayton handled the financial and tax structure with a team from Helena. Ruth hired a wealth management firm that Clayton recommended, run by a woman named Frances Cole, who had grown up in ranch country and understood, without being told, why Ruth wanted the numbers to do certain things and not others. She paid off the mortgage in Wichita. She settled Dale's medical debt in full, every last dollar, and felt something release in her chest that she hadn't fully known was clenched. She set aside a fund for Marcus and Lindsay that was enough to matter, and not so much that it replaced anything they should build themselves. She'd thought carefully about the proportions, and Marcus had not argued with them, which told her she'd gotten it right. The rest she organized around 3 things. The first was the farmhouse, which she repaired properly. New windows, new roof on the east wing. The porch rebuilt correctly by a carpenter Dot recommended, who worked the way Dale had worked, and measuring twice and cutting once, and not apologizing for taking the time to do it right. The second was a restitution research fund, established in Earl's name, that contracted with Petra Voss's organization and 2 others to pursue the cases Earl hadn't been able to resolve. Not just the 5 families from the chamber, but the broader question of wartime asset displacement in the region, which turned out to be larger and less resolved than Ruth had known before she started. The third thing was the simplest. She stayed. She stayed in Ridge Creek. She stayed on the 200 acres of scrubland that produced nothing commercially and required constant attention, and got brutal in January and gorgeous in a spare and enormous way. And in the long June evenings, when the light lasted until 10 and the grass went gold and the sky went colors, she still didn't have words for after 8 months of looking at it. She stayed because Earl had stayed, and she understood now what staying had cost him and what it had meant and what it had made possible. You couldn't do what he'd done from somewhere else. You had to be present, consistently, for decades, in the specific place that held the specific thing you were responsible for. That was the whole lesson. That was what the barn had been trying to tell anyone willing to climb the ladder and press their palm against the floor and pay attention to the draft of cold air rising from below. Dot came for dinner on Thursdays. Martin Geller's wife brought eggs from her chickens, and Ruth returned the cartons washed. Bernard Halley retired in April and referred his remaining clients to a young attorney in Billings, and on his last day, he stopped by the farmhouse and had coffee and said of Earl, "He was the most particular man I ever represented." "I'm sorry I didn't know him better," Ruth said. "I think that's what he'd have wanted." Bernard thought about it and nodded, and said that was probably true. In May, she opened the barn for a single public event, a small gathering that the County Historical Society organized around Earl's story, his wartime role holding assets for displaced families, the decades of patient searching, the documentation he'd kept with such precision for so long. 40 people came, which was nearly 10% of Ridge Creek's population, and several of them had stories of their own about the Depression and what their families had hidden and where and why. A woman in her 80s said her father had buried silver dollars in coffee cans along the fence line in 1934, and they'd never found more than a few of them, and she'd always wondered where the rest had gone. Ruth said she'd be happy to help look someday, and meant it. She had been, her whole working life, a woman who organized other people's information so they could find what they needed when they needed it. She had done that in a dental office for 12 years and thought of it as a modest skill in service of a modest purpose. Earl had shown her that the skill was the same, whether the records were appointment schedules or the provenance documentation for $295 million in gold held in trust across 8 decades. And you made things findable. You preserved the trail. You kept the record honest so that when the right person came looking, they could find the truth and know what to do with it. She was still doing that. She would probably always be doing that. The scale had changed. The stakes had changed. The view from her kitchen window was different now. 200 Montana acres instead of a Wichita street. And the balance in the account she'd had $12 in was different now in ways that still occasionally made her put down whatever she was holding and stand in the middle of a room until the vertigo passed. But the work was the same work, and the woman doing it was the same woman who had driven 14 hours alone, because a dead man's letter said to look for herself before anyone else told her what she was looking at. She had looked, so she had seen. She had not flinched from what the seeing required. That, in the end, was the whole of it. Not the gold. The gold was just the occasion. The whole of it was this. A woman who had nothing left to lose had gone somewhere everyone told her was empty, and found that the most important things are almost never in plain view. They're under the floor. They're in the letters the careful man wrote and couldn't send. They're in the cold breath of air rising from a place that has been waiting, patient and sealed, for the person with the courage to kneel down and press their palm against the boards and feel for what's beneath. Earl Whitmore had kept his faith for 94 years. Aunt Ruth Calloway had driven 14 hours on the strength of a sentence, "Don't let anyone else tell you what you're looking at," and found out what faith was worth. It turned out it was worth quite a lot, in every way that actually counted. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.